Nebraska's wheat farmers had harvested 31% of their crop as of the latest USDA crop progress report. That's 9 points behind the state's 5-year average. Those growers can now be focusing on controlling any weeds appearing in those fields, according to UNL Extension cropping system specialist Bob Klein. We talked with Bob Monday near North Platte, an area of the state that has been drier than normal over the past few seasons.
Well, the last couple of years we've really been dry in this area, and we were pretty dry until later part of May, and then later part of May and June we were pretty well blessed with some good rainfalls, and that really helped our wheat crops this year. Before that it looked like we wouldn't even have much of a wheat crop in this area in 2014.
Has the moisture also been benefiting some of the problems in wheat now, such as weeds?
Yes, really benefited the weeds. And a lot of the stands weren't too thick this year because of the limited moisture we had last fall for germination and then for tillering and so forth. And so our stands were a little bit thin, and of course the weeds take advantage of that, the kind of less tillering and also good soil moisture. So we're seeing quite a bit of broadleaf weeds and grasses out there in the wheat fields this year that weren't treated earlier.
What does your research show as to how much that can affect the moisture that's already in the soil?
Yeah, some research we did a few years ago out in this area showed that if we don't control the weeds after winter wheat harvest, we can lose in the fall 3 inches of soil water. And that soil water is pretty important to us out here.
What can you get from the grain that moisture would take?
Yeah, in general on corn and grain sorghum, we usually benefit about 10 to 12 bushels for every inch of soil water. So with 3 inches of loss, that can be 30 to 36 bushel of grain that we don't get the next year.
Now, when is it important to control these weeds by so that they don't grow into seed and just spread around?
Yeah, that's really important to get them before they set seed, because then you also have to control the weeds and makes them a lot more difficult to control with that big weed seed bank the next year. So you want to make sure you control them as soon as you can. Now with the broadleaf weeds, you usually have to wait a little bit while after harvest so that they can leaf back out a little bit, because you're cutting them off at harvest time, and so you got to wait a little bit on that. The grassy weeds, if it's mainly grassy weeds you have out there, usually shortly after harvest you can go in and control those, because you aren't cutting those off unless you're running the platform really low.
How do your treatment options differ depending on what you're going to plant into that field next?
Yeah, well, one of the things, if we're going to use corn or grain sorghum in the fall, we'll put on some atrazine. If we're going to sunflowers and so forth, we can't use atrazine on some of those kinds of crops. But we don't want to put that atrazine on until we cool off in September, because it breaks down really fast. I know some work that we did a few years ago, 3 pounds of atrazine in mid-July actually didn't last as good as 1 pound in the middle of September. And so we just, at this time, we go in and use burn down herbicides or growth regulators, glyphosate plus 2,4-D and Banville to control those broadleaf weeds. The glyphosate, of course, will take care of the grassy weeds.
Finally, even when you're not talking about a heavy soybean rotation, are you still seeing some resistance to glyphosate, and even without that, resistance to other chemicals? Yeah,
when we look at kochia, we've got glyphosate resistance in here. There's a few other weeds that also have Palmer amaranth and so forth that we're seeing glyphosate resistance. Another thing on our kochia, we actually saw some ALS resistance and so forth. So we got to make sure we put the right herbicide programs together to control these weeds. And that's another reason why we want to control these weeds before they set seed this summer. And normally they start setting seed sometimes late July, early August. And so we want to make sure we get timely applications to control those.
Weed resistance has become a major issue in Nebraska and in other states. The Nebraska Soybean Board recently sponsored herbicide-resistant field days in Fremont and Lincoln. We'll have more from there in a few minutes.